We are in Genesis 19 tonight. And if you've been disturbed by some of the content of Genesis so far, buckle up, Buttercup. We go from R to NC-17 tonight, so sorry about that. That's what's there. Genesis chapter 19, beginning in verse 1, and we'll read through verse 11. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. And he said, Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way. They said, however, No, but we shall spend the night in the square. Yet he urged them strongly, so they turned aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them, and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. And they called to Lot and said to him, Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may have relations with them. But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind them, and said, Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have two daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you, and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. But they said, Stand aside. Furthermore, they said, This one came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them. So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. But the men reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door. They struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. Excuse me. Okay, what do we think about that scene?
A horrible story.
Certainly is.
Do you know how old those dogs were?
They would probably have been pretty young, since he has not married them off yet. So they have older siblings that have been married. So these would have been his, I guess, probably his youngest two daughters, but he may have had other children younger. But they would have been pretty young, probably 14, 15, 16, somewhere in there.
When these angels, these men come up there, Lot's sitting at the gate of the city, which is a place where kind of the elder people would sit in the city. I mean, I don't know, I get the idea that Lot had come here years before, and he knew the kind of place that it was, but yet at the same time, Lot had some comfortableness or some element of status in the city that he would be sitting out at the gate where the elders generally sat. I don't know if that's completely true, but that's the idea that I get. It was his home. He'd lived there for a long time, although they did refer to him as an outsider. But yet this is a place that he made his home. And he was aware of what kind of place it was.
Yeah. Lot has chosen this area to His uncle Abraham said, "You go one way, I'll go the other," and Lot chose the direction that landed him in Sodom. He also had been abducted from Sodom in the so-called War of the Kings, and Abram had gone and rescued him and brought him back, delivered him back here. I think our kind of reaction to this is, why is he here? And why doesn't he leave if it's so bad?
Well, like Ed said, it's interesting that he has some kind of standing in the city, sitting there at the gate, and yet they say, like Ed mentioned, they said, this guy came here as a foreigner and now he wants to play the judge.
Maybe they ought to let him play the judge, huh?
Yeah.
But like Lot has a lot of faith, and he see his brothers in such a depraved manner that he's wanting to give his daughters to them so that they can become more Christ-like, or at least what that might look like.
Okay, we'll look at the daughter situation. We've already kind of brought it up, but we'll come back to it. That's a good point. It's very troubling, I think. And you've kind of hit upon the solution to it a little bit. It's a difficult one. To look, I think one of the challenges for the story for us, maybe to find relevance to us or for us, is if we make the story only about homosexuality, then maybe it doesn't have a lot of relevance to us. We say, this is not my pattern of behavior, this is not my orientation, this is not my world. Then it's kind of, that's what it's all about. So it's just kind of a lurid story that we don't really maybe even need to look at, because this isn't my problem. In the big scheme of things, in the ancient world, in a lot of pagan cultures, homosexuality was not what, at least how it is presented today in our culture. This isn't an alternative lifestyle. This was something that would have been practiced by a lot of men in powerful places. And it is much more about social dominance. It would be much more something akin to what happens in prisons. I'm not saying PD could maybe tell us horror stories. I don't know, but it's a cultural thing where one person would establish dominance over another person. And in this particular context, Lot does have status, as we've seen, and that status makes him perhaps secure day in and day out from this type of violation. But in a rebellion situation, where he's trying to hold them back, now all of a sudden his power may be ignored, his status may be ignored, and he too is vulnerable.
Well, you have a mob, basically.
You have a mob.
All the men from the whole city came there, and so it's basically mob mentality. And so whatever status you had, the mob isn't thinking that way anymore.
So yeah, we can kind of. I think it's really more of a question, and this may sound crazy, but this is really more of a way of contrasting the attitude towards the vulnerable that Abraham and Lot have against how the people of Sodom are. The main thing about these two travelers, yes, they're male, and of course the relations would be homosexual, but they are two traveling men all by themselves. Lot is a wealthy man with servants and people around him. He is not as vulnerable to this type of exploitation as these men are. And Abram sees three men traveling. He takes them in, takes care of them, feeds them, kills the fatted calf, is eminently hospitable to them. Lot sees two, the two that leave while the Lord stays and talks with Abraham in chapter 18. These two have arrived, and they're on a fact-finding mission for God, aren't they? They're going to go Yeah, I've heard terrible things. I want to find out if they're true. Well, Lot could have told him they were true, I think, before that, and then this absolutely kind of confirms it. But two men traveling alone would have been a very vulnerable target. In the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, one man is traveling alone and set upon by thieves, beaten, and left for dead. Two men traveling alone, a little bit better, not that much better, not against the mob. So these are vulnerable people that Abraham and Lot take in and care for. Now, we know they're not really vulnerable. We know the end of the story. We know they're able to defend themselves quite well from any size mob, but they are perceived as vulnerable. They are perceived as vulnerable. Abraham takes care of them. Lot takes care of them. Lot knows their precise vulnerability in this culture and goes to great lengths to protect them. And I think if we can get past the idea of homosexuality involving here, we can see this treatment of the vulnerable. How do we treat the vulnerable that we come across day in and day out? Now, I'm not saying that we will treat them as the men of Sodom desired to treat these two vulnerable people, but do we treat them in an exploitative manner, or do we treat them in a ministering manner where we take them in and care for them and take kind of responsibility for their well-being? Now, our cultures change over time, and two people traveling alone, hopefully, Sherry and I travel alone together all the time, and we haven't had anything like this ever happen. So maybe we're just blessed. I don't know, but things change. But there are times in your life where you're going to be extremely vulnerable. People in prison are very vulnerable. They have all of their capacity to defend themselves in a lawful manner taken away from them, don't they, PD?
Yes.
They're not. They're supposed to be good little boys while they're in there, and maybe they're trying to be good little boys and do their time and get back to their lives. Maybe most of them are, I don't know, but there's always going to be some that are in there maybe with no hope of getting out, and they're trying to elevate their status in that environment to whatever level they can possibly get it to be. And this is the world they're in the rest of their lives, and they're making the best of it from their perspective, I guess. But I think we can set aside, to some extent, for our purposes, the precise nature of the exploitation and focus on the attempt to exploit the vulnerable versus the attempt to care for the vulnerable. Now, we may feel like we're in the middle ground. Maybe most of the time we ignore the vulnerable. But in ignoring the vulnerable, are we caring for them, or are we?
If you ignore it, you're not there.
Are you leaving? You're leaving them vulnerable, aren't you?
You're leaving them at whatever's going to happen. Lot did not do that. Matter of fact, he was fairly forceful in his getting them to come and stay with him. I mean, he just basically probably didn't take them by the arm and take them there, but he was sure trying to do that.
He didn't want to take no for an answer, did he?
He
Because
did. The other thing I think about it, I don't know how long it was from the flood when mankind was terrible to this point. I don't know how long, but it got right back to this, the reason God, destroyed humanity except for a few people with the great flood due to their
depravity.
the total depravity that they have
right.
really sunk to again, once again, the total rebellion.
I mean, I can't imagine the depravity that's a big word, but I know what it means,
Mhm.
or I heard what it meant. Anyway, but
Even vandals know what depravity is, huh?
Yeah, I guess.
Mhm.
I don't know. Anyway, where was I going? Now I'm lost.
Well, you're tying it back, I think rightly, to the flood, to the pre-flood.
And, you know, and here the same thing is happening again, maybe not in as broad a spectrum as it was before, but certainly these two towns and cities, whatever, and sounds like the surrounding area were involved in the wherewithal. But, you know, and God came in and did the same thing again. He destroyed, it was kind of like having a spot fire and you put it out. And he basically, that's what he basically did.
So it's, yes, it's an example of just sinking to a point where, I mean, I don't know how things have always been. Now when you travel, for the most part, I found when I travel, if I happen upon the locals, they are welcoming and helpful. They try to help you get along your way, maybe because they don't want you around anymore, but you know, there's this kind of general human inclination towards helping the traveler, because whenever we travel, we all get turned around a little bit, and even with GPS, even I've had Google Maps try to get me to turn down a railroad track in my car one time. So I didn't do it, but it's you know, there's this general ethic of helping the wanderer, helping the traveler, and instead of doing that, they are exactly the opposite. They are trying to destroy effectively. And it's really hard to see the world return to this level again since the flood. What is really shocking is at the end of the book of Judges, we see this same story basically playing out. Almost the exact same story playing out within the nation of Israel. When the Levite is traveling and he's with his concubine and is within the realm of Benjamin, and the men of Benjamin come to the house and say, give us this Levite too. And in that case, the homeowner only has one daughter. He offers his daughter, but he also offers the concubine. He ends up just throwing the concubine out. And the men of Benjamin do what? Say, well, yeah, we don't want the concubine. We're not interested in her. No, they rape her to death. And that's in the nation of Israel. And it leads to civil war within the nation, ultimately almost eliminating the nation, the tribe of Benjamin. So it's this terrible, shockingly horrible story, makings of a horror movie, basically, is not just played out outside of the people of God, but it happens within the people of God to show that they have also within them the capacity for this level of evil, that they're not exempt from it. And to me, the hardest part about the story of Lot is the fact that in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 7, he's referred to as righteous Lot. And I guess that to some extent is the hospitality he's showing these gentlemen. But when you offer your daughters up, that makes it hard for me to think of him as being righteous. Willing to go out there and stand and take a risk for himself is one thing. Abraham has stood between God and wicked people, but close to God and away from the wicked people. Lot is between God in a sense and wicked people, but he's more proximate to the wicked people, and it's bringing him. I think both are brave plays, but then to kind of placate these horrible people, these perverts, with your virgin daughters, I have a hard time getting through the hoop of calling him righteous Lot at that point. Is that hard for anybody else to see the Lot's righteousness in that context?
I think we don't know that much about Lot, truthfully.
Truthfully, no.
So we don't really know what all is, whatever else happened. This story here, we're a gas plant. In today's culture and whatnot, we're a gas plant. I don't know, in that culture, obviously it wasn't unheard of. And women were treated poorly at the best, best I can say it. They had no rights whatsoever. They were, chattel, whatever. So it's hard for us to judge that, but it's hard, for a person to say, well, this guy offered his daughters to a mom, and you're doing that he's righteous. That's hard. It really is. But there's obviously a lot more about Lot than the two stories we hear in this chapter.
Well, yeah, there's 3 or 4, but yeah, they don't. He doesn't come out.
He
And
doesn't look too shiny.
he doesn't look great at the end of the chapter either. So this is just the beginning of this salacious narrative. But in a way, I guess you could say it gets worse. It starts out here, and then it really gets bad, I guess you could say. But it is, again, if we look at it in terms of hospitality, and this is hard for us. As I've said, our idea of good hospitality is to offer both sweet and unsweet tea to our guests. To have both there. That's good, being a good host and being hospitable. I'm not a good host. If you ever come to my house for dinner, there will be only unsweet tea. If you want to ruin a perfectly good glass of tea by putting sugar in it, that's your business. I'm not going to do it for you. So that's how I operate. But
I didn't know you could be a senator or not.
Well, that's what I was wondering, I guess from the north part of the south.
I guess I grew up in the South, and everywhere we went, there was always sweet tea and unsweet tea, and they would go down about the same. Well, some people who even like sweet tea want to sweeten it their own way and to their own extent, but I've never liked sweet tea. I've never liked sugar in my coffee. Kind of like I'm bitter, and I want my drinks to be bitter as well, I guess. Their idea of hospitality, and it's what a lot asserts to people, is I've taken them under my roof, which means I am absolutely and totally responsible for their well-being. I'm not, okay, you can come in and then make yourself at home and, do whatever suits you suit yourself with whatever happens. We have efficient, courteous self-service here, No, you take them into your home. They are absolutely your responsibility at that point. And when you combine that with the view of the time of ancient cultures regarding female sexuality, which was that it was always a property right, and it either belonged to the father to sell as a bride and get the bride price for, or it belonged to the husband. It was never the woman's with her own control of her own body. That was never the case. It either belonged to her father or it belonged to her husband. The only time it was the woman is if she got divorced or her husband died, and she, at that point, might become a prostitute and use her own sexuality for her own agency. Hopefully that's changed today. I don't know, hopefully. We still have some remnants of it, though. How many of you ladies got given away by your father at your weddings? Kind of a symbolic vestige, I guess you could say, or a nod to the past. We have this idea now that when a teenage girl fools around, makes some poor choices, she's really letting her father down. She's kind of cheating on her father almost, it sounds like. They take the purity vow with the father. And I've kind of thought that was strange, in part because we don't really think of a teenage boy messing around cheating on his mother, do we? So, but this is the thing. This is the culture where the female sexuality, these daughters, their sexuality belongs to their father. So what Lot is doing is not so much in the mind of this culture allowing his daughters to be raped. he is foregoing his property right. He is giving up an enormous amount of money to buy the safety of these two men. Now, that still is hard for me to say, okay, well, he was righteous after all. But again, some of this is cultural expectations. What you think someone would do is incredibly gracious and generous, and what other people would think, would be terribly, just horrible behavior. It's the contrast. It's where Tammy told me a little bit about the history of the Frenchtown settlement, where the Native Americans and I guess were they Adventist missionaries that were out here working with them?
No, they were Episcopalian.
So Protestant, mainline Protestant missionaries working with the Native Americans, and it ended poorly, evidently, with some cultural misunderstandings that led to massacre. So this happens with human beings sometimes. Hopefully now we can at least factor in, hey, this is cultural. Let's back off a little bit. Let's not get too offended. Let's research this and find out if we have a right to be offended or not.
Oh, yeah, that's working out good today.
And, yeah.
Today's society, yeah.
I think it worked for a while. We may have abandoned it now, but so that's how they can look at it and come out with righteous lot. A man willing to give up his own daughters to a bunch of sexual perverts, a bunch of sexual predators. He's trying to purchase with money out of his pocket the safety of his guests. That's his primary responsibility at this time, in their culture, in their mind, and their way of looking at it.
But how did he know that, and Abraham know these were lords?
I think he doesn't know.
Well, he bowed down and said, "My Lord."
Well, that can be just.
They walked up to strangers, come up, and he bows down and says, "My Lord." And Abraham, when the three came, and yet the town people saw him as men.
Well, I think he did not understand exactly. I think those could be terms of respect, honor. In Spanish, when they say Lord, they say Señor. It's the same word, Mr. We translate it Mr. most of the time. But Señor, they'll pray to Lord Jesus, Señor Jesus Christo. So it's a term of respect, a term of honor. He obviously does not have any idea how secure they are from the threat.
And this is true, because he knew what would happen to him, so he invited them into his house for protection.
If he knew who he was dealing with, he could have said, "You want these guys? Here they are." Yeah. So he doesn't know who he's protecting, but he takes on the responsibilities of very vulnerable people he thinks are vulnerable.
And it was the same way though with Abraham. When he saw him, he ran and bowed down before him, and it's the strangers.
Well, there's nothing wrong with great men showing humility from time to time, is there? Something our leaders could learn today. To show an ounce of humility. Humility is not weakness. So, does not diminish your greatness one bit to act humble. So it's a shocking story. The horror that is proposed does not actually occur. The daughters come out of this, at least at this point, unscathed. The predators are struck blind. Some of them are anyway. So, the great danger seems to be somewhat averted. I can't trust that clock. Did you reset that clock, PD?
Yes.
Okay. It's a little slow, but not bad. Okay. I do want to get through this in 2 weeks. So let's look at the next section, verses 12 through 26. Then the two men said to Lot, whom else have you here? A son-in-law and your sons, your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of this place. For we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord, that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters, and said, up, get out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. When the morning dawned, the angels urged Lot, saying, up, take your wife, your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city. But he hesitated. So the men seized his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hands of his two daughters, for the compassion of the Lord was upon him, and they brought him out and put him outside the city. When they had brought him outside, one said, escape for your life, do not look behind you, and do not stay anywhere in the valley. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away. But Lot said to them, O my lords, now behold, your servant has found favor in your sight, and you have magnified your loving kindness, which you have shown me by saving my life. But I cannot escape to the mountains, for the disaster will overtake me, and I will die. Now behold, this town is near enough to flee to, and it is small. Please let me escape there. Is it not small, that my life may be saved? He said to them, behold, I grant you this request, also not to overthrow the town of which you have spoken. Hurry, escape there, for I cannot do anything until you arrive there. Therefore the name of the town was called Zoar. The sun had risen over the earth when Lot came to Zoar. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of the heaven. And he overthrew the cities and all the valley and the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. But his wife from behind him looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Okay.
I had forgotten that they had to be drug out of town.
Kicking and screaming. With great reluctance. With more reluctance than the two men displayed at coming into Lot's house. Lot is more reluctant to lay, they have to physically lay hands on. And the sons-in-law, I guess, were betrothed or whatever. And there were maybe some other family members or whatever in the, his sons are mentioned in verse 12. You know, it's ultimately, it's just Lot, his wife, and his two virgin daughters that escape the doom of Sodom and Gomorrah. And really and truly by the skin of their teeth and almost against their will do they get out of there. Any other thoughts on this?
Lot had to leave all his earthly possessions. They didn't say pack up the trunk and get it.
Or bring your servants.
Yeah. It wasn't in the entourage.
No, they didn't get to pack up a mule or anything like that and take it with them. But once again, I know they keep bargaining, don't they? I can't go to the mountains. I can go to this little town over here. I can go to a town called Zoar.
That's why he thought he couldn't go to the mountain.
He kind of ends up there, but yeah, it's
There, there's no indication of why or whatever, but evidently there was something there that worried him some.
it seems like to me like he in the dealings he ends up saving that city. That city may have been destroyed along with everything else if Lot hadn't gone there. The angel seems to have two directives: destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, make sure Lot is safe in the mountains. And when the in the mountains gets choked on, the angel has to make an executive decision and say, okay, you go to that town because I've got this other one that is the primary directive, and it is going to override this other one if you don't get out of town. So he does a lot, again, bargains, and in the bargaining perhaps saves some people. And I think it shows, you know, we come to God sometimes in some desperate situations. And most of the time, I think you can say those situations have a lot to do with the choices we've made. Sometimes they do not. Sometimes they just fall on our lap. This is a terrible thing we have to deal with. Does Lot play some part in his plight here? From our reading, it kind of looks like it, doesn't it? I mean, he was kind of greedy with his uncle. He's doing it the easy way. He's wealthy man. He can go live wherever he wants, and he remains. Again, we don't get to just check out of our cities because we don't like our cities, because they've got problems. We are called to be the light wherever we are. And maybe Lot was the only hope. Maybe Abraham was trying to get down to one man, and that be Lot, that saves Sodom and Gomorrah. But God in the negotiation won't go to one. He'll go to 10, but that's it. Then he closes it. If there's 10, safe. Then he closes it.
You mentioned verse 7 in 2 Peter, and verse 8, it talks about how Lot was troubled by what was going on there. It troubled his soul and stuff. So,
In 2 Peter
yes, I'm sorry. Yeah,
Yes.
2 Peter chapter
2. So,
mentioned verse 7 where it calls him righteous, and then in verse 8 it talks about how he was troubled by where he was living. So, yeah, like you say, there's a lot that we don't know about why he was there, or why he chose to stay there.
why does any Christian live in Las Vegas? Why does any Christian live in Hollywood or wherever? Whatever town you think is the current equivalent of Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's the only hope those cities have. I mean, if they don't have Christians living, righteous people living in them, then there's no hope for them. And it's nice to be in the political and social cultural majority, and that be basically in alignment with your own belief system. It's really nice. It's a very comfortable existence. It is uncomfortable to be where you are outnumbered severely. And, sometimes even the state of Washington, particularly when we lived in Western Washington, I live in King County and I hear the news and all that stuff and their take on the news and everything. And I've told Sherry many times they've got a different way of looking at the world than I do. But I have never felt like these people were going to kill me. Before this summer, perhaps. But now, I don't know. But before the summer, I always felt safe. I went to grad school in Portland, and it's as hippy-dippy, and you see what's going on in Portland right now. And I went down there and ate at the restaurants and, spent time in downtown Portland, the squarest of squares that they could ever find, and the roundest of squares, I guess, they could ever find, and never had anybody act anything but nice towards me. That was my experience. So I'm really sad to see this happening, because it had an ethic of, we're weird, but we want you to accept us and we will accept you. And that seems to have gone right out the window. Maybe it hasn't. Maybe these are just a few idiots that are destroying everything. But that's. I have a soft space in my heart for Portland, much softer than I do for Seattle. But that's kind of the culture that they're in. And Lot can't save Sodom and Gomorrah, but he ends up saving Zoar, this little town. He's able to get there and maybe save some lives that way. The relatively negative portrayal of women in Genesis continues with Lot's wife looking back, becoming a pillar of salt and kind of in a legendary status. The reason the Dead Sea is so salty is because that salty woman is right in the middle of it, I guess, now. So that's a kind of a myth associated with it. But it's it's a broken world all the way around, I guess you could say. And the brokenness of others will affect even some of God's righteous people. It's just, we don't get to be exempt from it. We have to long for what God is leading us to rather than where we're at, though. While we dwell in a broken world and we try to be the instruments by which God heals it, we still need to keep that longing in us. It's one thing to love your flawed, broken neighbors because you know of your own flaws, your own brokenness. It's another thing to love them more than you love the Holy One of Israel, the Holy God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to trust in his promises. Maybe Lot's reluctance is, I've got all this stuff, and if I leave it, it's going to get destroyed. I'm going to lose everything. Well, God gave it to you in the first place. You'll take care. He's getting you out of this place. He's not going to lead you somewhere where you will starve to death in the future. But we see a lack of faith in Lot's daughters, and we'll look at that more next week. So thank you for your attention and comments. Let's see who is here. Sherry checked in, Mindy checked in, Nell checked in, and Robert and Connie said they were going to be watching. So thanks everybody for showing up, and Ed's going to lead us in a closing prayer here.